Welcome all of you. It is my great pleasure to moderate today this panel discussion that we have organized on the question of Syria and the possibility of a military strike against Syria. My name is Frank Griffel. I am the chair of the Council of Middle East Studies here at Yale. It is my great pleasure to, as I said, moderate and also introduce the panel. Before we start, I should stress that all of us on this panel just speak in our own name, despite the fact that we do actually have employers, that we also to some degree represent these employers. We speak only in our own name, and we do not speak in the name of any organization or institution where we actually work. I would ask you in this case to also put your mobile phones on vibration, or better even put them off, in order not to disturb the panel. What I will do now, I will introduce the panel briefly and give each one of the panelists a certain amount of time for opening statements. Overall, I hope that these opening statements will not take more than 3/4 of an hour, so that we then actually can engage in a Q&A with the audience. First, on my right here is Professor Ellen Lust-Ocker. She is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Yale, well known on the campus. She's been at Yale for more than 10 years. And she works on various countries, Syria, Jordan, Libya, and Egypt, and has received numerous academic awards. Most recently, she actually was for 1 year at the NYU Law School. Next to her is Charles Hill, diplomat in residence and distinguished fellow at the International Security Studies program here at Yale. He was in the past a fellow at the Hoover Institutions and has also a distinguished career in the US Foreign Service as well as the United Nations. Next to him is Dr. Hassan Barari, Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Jordan in Amman. He taught Middle East Studies at the University of Nebraska and was a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute for Peace. He's a columnist in Jordan for Jordanian newspapers and has published widely in the field of Middle East Studies. Emma Skye is a visitor at Yale. Oh, sorry, that's not true. Is a fellow at Yale, is a senior fellow, to be precise, at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs here at Yale. She's a British citizen and has done AIDS work in the Middle East and worked as an advisor with the US Provisional Authority in Iraq. She's been a visiting professor at King's College London, a fellow at Oxford, a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Finally, last but not least in this case, is Mohammed Al-Fayyoumi, who's currently a Yale World Fellow. And if he is not a Yale Fellow, he's actually in the Foreign Service of Egypt, where he was most recently posted to the Egyptian embassy in Syria, where one of his responsibilities was to hold contact with the Syrian opposition movement. So you see, many of us on this panel, in this case, have lived in the Middle East. Some of us come from the Middle East, and others are renowned experts on American foreign policy. I first give the word, in this case, to Professor Ellen Lust for her opening comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, for convening this, and colleagues for joining, and all of you for attending what I think is an important topic and an important discussion. And frankly, in my case, I think a very humbling one, because I would like to sort of feel like I had the words of wisdom and all the solutions, and I feel very, very far from that. What I wanted to sort of suggest today is, frankly, that not much changed on August 21st, and that in some ways I find that somewhat frightening. First of all, what not much changed, and that may seem surprising, right? All of a sudden we had a national, sort of an international crisis that hadn't seemed like a crisis before, and all of a sudden this is a sort of a major issue on the sort of US, certainly domestic agenda, and on the international agenda. Interestingly, though, in some ways, despite the ways in which that seems like a new, and obviously it's an important event, it wasn't the first time chemical weapons have been used against domestic populations, right? We've seen that in Iraq, we've seen that elsewhere. It wasn't the first time that we actually knew that the Syrian regime was willing to use force and to kill its own people. We've known that for a couple of years now. In many ways, if you want to be able to say that the Syrian regime goes back farther into the Fathers period, we've known that for decades, right? It wasn't actually sort of also a change in the regional and the international issues and the constellation of issues on the table. And I think that's important because one of the things that got lost in the early sort of reaction to what were, I think, really horrific pictures, and rightly so they're horrific pictures, was the fact that the same sort of issues that were on the table, the regional ones and the international ones that had stopped us from acting prior to this, hadn't actually changed. We still have to worry about Iran and Russia and what they would do. We still have to worry about sort of the kind of the spillover effects in terms of Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere, and none of that was really changing. And finally, I would argue that there was nothing really changing with regards to the balance of forces between the rebels and the government. So in some ways, right, we have this huge change, and on the other hand, in some ways, there's actually not a lot that's different. And I think that was important because you really essentially kind of the biggest issue and the biggest sort of point of the crisis was the fact that there had been sort of the kind of the line drawn in the sand, right? This was the red line that wasn't supposed to be crossed, and it was crossed. So there was an issue of credibility. There was an issue in terms of sort of what we had said we would do and what we could react to then, which was a very much a diplomatic issue and a domestic issue, but all of the kinds of parameters around it hadn't necessarily changed. If we were to step back, and I can discuss this more in the Q&A if we want, but I would argue that the concern that then would be raised, right? So the reaction to that, right, there was a couple of possible ones. One would have been a very immediate strike, kind of a Israeli-style strike on sort of targets immediately that could have been very limited and kind of gone with sending the signal, fulfilling the promise, and not destabilizing the regime or doing too much. That obviously time has passed. So then the next sort of question was, can we move to a period where we talk then about limited strikes? And it was an interesting period because it's one which now I'm talking about slightly in the past tense because it seems like sort of events move on quickly. But it was a period when the issue was to have a strike that essentially fulfilled the promise but didn't really do too much, right? So the idea that was sort of being bandied about was having it be limited enough so that it didn't actually kind of provoke the rest of the regional actors. I frankly found that very disturbing. And again, it may be sort of a time we don't necessarily need to talk about it as much, but I found it disturbing because in my mind what it did was actually help to kind of further empower Bashar al-Assad, because in many ways there was a rallying effect that was going on inside Syria, right? All of a sudden, the call that the United States was letting Syria be next on the list that went from Syria back to Libya and back to Iraq was being sort of bandied about and really mobilizing, and I have personal experience with this, sort of the hatred against America and against this kind of intervention, and therefore the support for Bashar from people who normally wouldn't actually be so very supportive of Bashar. Right? So it was actually kind of an interesting way of effectively sort of shoring up the regime. And again, sort of more importantly, there was questions about sort of if you were moving people and others into the strike zone, then what was the damage that was going to be done as a result. So I couldn't say I was very excited about limited strikes. I think in some ways, I mean, if it's true that the sort of the proposals that are now being bandied about and the idea of having international control over chemical weapons is actually serious on the table, then what it leads us to is still thinking about what is changed and therefore what next. And that's what I want to spend some time thinking about. And I don't claim to have any great answers on this, so just to be very clear about that from the outset. But I think that there's three things or three options that are essentially sort of large options on the table, and that we can think about the possibilities and the sort of how much we want them to be the case. Okay, the first one, of course, is this question about backing the Syrian rebels until they win, right? So there is a notion, and there's been a notion of stepping up force or stepping up support for, and we like to call them the moderate rebels. We like to sort of have a notion that you pick the rebels that you support and you don't pick the others. Of course, one of the reasons that there was some opposition early to putting in, especially things like anti-aircraft missiles, is what happens to the arms that you give, and do they necessarily stay with the people that you give them to? So there is an issue here, which is how much can you actually think that you control the sort of the forces that you're backing. I think a second issue that especially the United States always really needs to be very, very careful of and recognize is that there's a question of if you're trying to support one side, on the one hand it may support them at least militarily, on the other hand, frankly, it may undermine their legitimacy. And I don't think that we can sort of just turn a blind eye to that. More importantly, I have concerns about sort of the ways in which the recent events have affected this. Right? Obviously, if there's this notion in which those who you support get delegitimized because it's American support, in some ways we've only diminished the support for those who would be our allies. Importantly, I think we've also diminished American support for being willing to do so. 2 minutes left. Okay. Secondly. So importantly, I had to be starting at 6 after, but okay. So importantly, I think the problem with that is that ultimately leads to a keep the war going kind of an option. All right? In terms of the result of trying to back rebels, not doing so sort of full stop, will lead to the other sides, Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, et cetera, continuing to do the same thing, and we end up with keeping the war going. The second option, which you hear on the table a lot, and which I find, frankly, is sort of okay, you were right. I find, frankly, sort of problematic is an idea that keeping the war going is what you want. And let me simply say that by trying to do so, first of all, there will be no end point. In other words, there's never a time when the situation is going to get better or more easy to resolve than it is now. The spillover effects within the region are not going to change, and the assumptions that you're not going to sort of allow the radicals to get stronger isn't going to change. So that's not really an option. The critical issue, and here I actually seek my colleagues' help, is then to turn to one of diplomatic settlement, right? To really figure out a way to use what has just happened to try to push Russia to and Iran to peel away from support for Assad, which would be the factor that would lead to sort of to the split within the regime that would lead to both sides being willing to go back to the negotiating table. So basically, I think that's the trick. Now, my concern is essentially what we've done in the meantime, if we do take chemical weapons off the table, is lowered the costs of continuing the conflict. So my fear is that this is actually one more step towards the continue the conflict path, but that at the end of the day, what we actually have to figure out is a way to use this to leverage really the kind of pressure that it seems that Russia would actually respond to try to do not simply figuring out a new equilibrium we can all live at, but figuring out a way really to get back to the table. Sorry.
Edward Snowden, now in Moscow as special assistant to President Putin, has given us a highly classified telegram drafted by Russia's chief diplomat for the Middle East, Georgy Kennenkov, to President Putin, eyes only. This telegram was sent from the Russian embassy in Tehran, Iran. It's a long telegram. I can only read to you the main points. Translated into English, of course. I can't do the Russian accent. Begin the text. The situation is unprecedentedly excellent. Let us review it. President Obama, 4.5 years ago, launched his major plan to fundamentally transform the United States of America. To achieve this, he would have to take the U.S. out of its leadership role in international security, a role it has carried on for nearly 100 years. He has succeeded in doing so to a remarkable degree, making him potentially the most consequential president in American history. Of course, we are delighted with this American abdication of its leadership. At this moment, the situation is exceptionally favorable to us. When chemical weapons, nerve gas, was used in Syria to devastating, horrifying effect, it violated a fundamental principle of the international state system. a system which had relied upon American resolve. It also crossed a red line that President Obama himself had set, probably inadvertently. So Obama declared that the U.S. would take military action. But the success of his own strategy for transforming America meant that the country was unprepared psychologically, morally, politically, and militarily for such a military option. This led President Obama to explain for several days what he was not going to do. We, of course, found this amusing because the first rule of strategy is never tell your opponent what you are not going to do. All the while, Secretary of State Kerry was delivering powerful speeches on the need for immediate, forceful armed intervention. Suddenly, President Obama added another not. He was not going to decide to act. Instead, he would put the decision in the hands of the Congress. Congress quickly read the opinion polls, which reflected the success of President Obama's approach. The American people saw no reason to get involved. So the Congress, it appeared, was not going to authorize the president to take action. As of today, with the president scheduled to address the American people this evening, many in Congress are deeply concerned that to deny the president's request for authorization could be seen as tantamount to impeachment, or at the least, turn his presidency into a lame duck status with over 3 more years to go. So from our point of view, the situation has reached an ideal stage. The United States is close to locking itself into a permanent condition of international ineffectiveness. The country is politically fragmented, and Obama is regarded as confused and vulnerable. Thus, it was a brilliant move when our Foreign Minister Lavrov seized upon the offhand remark by Secretary Kerry to declare that we, Russia, would take the lead in a diplomatic process to place Syria's weapons of mass destruction under international control. And Syria, under orders from us, welcomed the idea. It has been amusing to see American politicians of all stripes racing to propose their acceptance of this face-saving way out. At this moment, it appears that President Obama will accept our leadership in his speech tonight. The American president will therefore be grateful to us and depend upon us, while at the same time, we are exactly where we want to be in that we have vast and successful experience in concealing and delaying all such programs to control chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. We are, of course, not alone in this. I am drafting this telegram from Tehran, where I have been in consultation with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Command and the Ayatollah. They, as you know, already have sent signals to the Americans that Iran is ready to negotiate comprehensively. This is because the Iranians also recognize that the Americans are at this moment confused and vulnerable and are looking for a way to be relieved of the crisis so that President Obama can continue with his program of fundamentally transforming America. The Iranians have compiled an astonishingly successful record of delaying and deceiving the Americans about Iran's relentless drive to acquire nuclear weapons. And in this new diplomatic offensive, they will continue to do so successfully. Permit me, my dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, to list the benefits of our current position. First, Russia has replaced the U.S. as the arbiter and leader in international security matters. Second, Russia and Iran are now perfectly placed by way of our two-pronged initiatives to, first, give President Obama a non-embarrassing way out of his dilemma, and second, to get, through skillful drafting, the survival of the Alawite regime in Syria, with Syria becoming a joint satellite of Russian power and Iran's emerging Shia hegemony over the Middle East. Third, our two initiatives will derail the incipient renewal of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And here may be the most monumental shift of all. The goal of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine is entirely in the context of an American-led international state system that has structured the modern age throughout its existence. The Palestinians now seeing the U.S. retreat and accommodate itself to our idea of international order will come to our way of thinking and abandon the two-state solution. Fourth, we can count on China to add to our initiative by conducting challenges to the U.S. in the East and South China Seas. We therefore stand at a turning point in history which is nothing less than the end of the modern age. Based upon the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Westphalian state system, we, the new powers, have never fully accepted the modern age with its individualism, human rights, and ideal of democracy. We know that a one-party state under firm political control in a hierarchical world governed by the big regional powers is far better as a way to control world affairs. You, dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, have called the collapse of the Soviet Union the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. The Islamic Republic of Iran, a true revolutionary movement, has set itself against the established international system since coming to power in 1979, even as it has used its status inside that system to serve its own strategy. The People's Republic of China has never fully accepted the modern international system. It accommodated itself to it in the post-Cold War years, but now has moved into a more assertive, adversarial stance. Thus, we stand at the dawn of an entirely new era, the end of the so-called modern and the birth of a troika of power, Russia, Iran, and China, capable of dominating the entire Eurasian landmass, including Western Europe, which, as the old geographers pointed out, means domination of the world as a whole. Respectfully submitted, Georgy Kenenkov.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I will deal with the regional implications of the American action or inaction. Let me say up front that the environment in the Middle East and how the Americans are operating in the Middle East. So America is, there are a lot of anti-American sentiments in this part of the world, in the Middle East. Basically because of the American policies over the last decades, but definitely since the 9/11, the occupation of Iraq, and also the support of the dictators and the support, of course, of the Israeli expansion. Here I'm not talking about the Israeli security. I'm talking about the Israeli expansion in the West Bank, in the West Bank in terms of settlement. So these three factors created a kind of environment that makes it really difficult for the Americans to operate. And within this environment, the Americans want to restore deterrence, deterrence that was broken down on August 21st when the chemical weapons were used for the first time and Obama's red lines were crossed. So the question is, how can the American restore this kind of deterrence? And if this means to be a punitive measure that strike a few token symbols of the Syrian regime, I think we most likely going to see the inverse effect. And here, all I can see is that deterrence would work for a short period of time, where the Syrian regime would use chemical weapon again in a matter of 2 months, 3 months, and whenever they see fit. So they will not be really deterred in the strategic sense of the word. And also, it would send a clear message to the Iranians that the Americans are not really serious about deterrence. So they would think that they can cross the red lines again with relative impunity. And in here I'm talking about the Iranian nuclear program. So if the Americans fail to act decisively, this would probably kind of avoid the Americans a kind of another venture in the Middle East, but it will bring America again, because Israel cannot stand aside and watch the Iranians developing nuclear capabilities and crossing the red lines again and doing nothing. So in this case, I think the United States would be drawn into a conflict that may be, and I'm not advocating that, may be acting now with avert a kind of another big problem in the Middle East. So the Israeli factor is a very important one. And also, if the American action would be a kind of a token one, this would also send a message to the American allies in the region that they cannot rely on the Americans. There's a kind of already a sense of the American is abandoning the region, and there's a kind of an American disengagement from the Middle East. And this actually really weakened and demoralized the American allies. And here I'm talking about the moderate state like Jordan, part of Lebanon, not all of Lebanon, of course, and Fatah movement led by Mahmoud Abbas, as well as Saudi Arabia and the GCC. But let's see what kind of scenarios that can materialize in the near future. The first one, if the Americans decide to act like militarily, and I'm not quite sure that the Congress would authorize that. But the first scenario is that the Americans hit hard, and in this case, they may break the regime or change the balance of forces in the civil war on the ground. And this would lead to probably the Pandora box would be opened. Iran, in this case, would feel that it is the country that is threatened most by such an act, and they might activate Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, now is fighting, is stretched in Lebanon and Syria, but it is fighting along the Syrian troops. We've seen this in June and July, when Hezbollah helped the Syrian troops to regain Al-Qusayr city, and it was very important strategically for both the regime and Hezbollah. And there are a lot of reports talking about Hezbollah involvement even in Aleppo, around Idlib, and even some of them close to Daraa in the south of Syria. So the last thing that Hezbollah wants is to get in another war with Israel. Hezbollah has been very successful in deterring the Sunni troops, groups in Lebanon that are trying to harass Hezbollah. But if the regime face imminent collapse, I think Hezbollah cannot deter these groups. And in this case, Iran, and because Iran is using a proxy wars in the Middle East, would use Hezbollah to activate and open another front with the Israelis, and this will probably reshuffle the whole cards in the Middle East. So this is a very important thing. But also the Iranians can carry out a kind of a proxy militant attacks in the Gulf, and they have the capabilities to do that, and they can do it, but so far they are not doing this. So Lebanon would be destabilized again, and also the day after scenario, we have to think of this. If the regime faces or is going to face a kind of collapse, the Iranians would think of a kind of reinsurgency, and this is what their rebels have been doing now. And maybe Iran would support their troops and their people working for them in order to degrade the capabilities, the military capabilities of the rebels. Also, a decisive show of American force in the region would assure the American allies and would also invigorate the rebels. And here, the rebels actually we can't lump them under in one basket here. If we look at the opposition in Syria, and I myself have done a lot of work in that, and you can't really think of a kind of a unified monolithic force. Even Al-Qaeda itself is divided in Iraq. We have the Islamic State for Iraq and Bilad al-Sham, led by al-Baghdadi, and the Nusra Front led by al-Julani. Al-Julani, he gave the oath of allegiance to al-Zawahiri, who is the ultimate leader of Al-Qaeda, and the ultimate leader of Al-Qaeda is for al-Nusra and not for the Islamic State in Iraq. So there are a lot of things here to be taken into account. And then on the other hand, we have the moderate forces. And this is where the Americans have failed, actually, against the American stated policy to strengthen and beef up the moderate forces. But over the last 2 years and a half, the Americans have done little to really beef up and strengthen these forces. Also, the opposition now is thinking of here I'm talking about some of the opposition groups. They think of kind of doing another Sahwat. Sahwat is the Iraqi revivals in 2007. Remember when David Petraeus came up with the idea of the search, and then Abdel Sattar Abu Risha in Iraq, he started this kind of revival, meaning they fight Al-Qaeda. So there are some rebels among the opposition in Syria now trying to join forces in order to fight Al-Qaeda as well as fight the regime itself. And I think these are the elements that the Americans, as well as the American allies in the region, need to think of working with. Also, civilians in Syria, they need to see an action, international action. You cannot gas people like this. Here I'm not talking about killing 100,000 people. It's okay, but killing 14 or 1,500 by chemical weapon is okay. So, but they need to see a kind of international reaction to what happened. Also, there's a scenario of the failure to act, and this would be, I think, the maybe a catastrophe for the Americans in the region. It would further demoralize American allies. It would further actually strengthen the Iranians, Hezbollah, and this axis. Let me just conclude with this note that it would be a different outcome if an attack, whatever the kind of attack, is accompanied with a strategy. And the strategy here, I'm talking about working meticulously in order to strengthen the moderate groups in Syria to continue their work, but also to work with the international community in order to use the attack if it materializes to push the Syrian regime to go to the Geneva II, or actually reconvene Geneva II, or do some political framework, political process. And thank you very much.
So on the 29th of August, the British Parliament voted to block UK involvement in military action against the Syrian regime. It was a close vote. It was blocked by 13 votes. And that's the first time since 1782 that a British Prime Minister lost a vote to go to war. 1782, you'll remember, or we won't go into that. According to the polls, 3/4 of Brits believe that the MPs were right to reject UK military action in Syria. 2/3 of those polled didn't care if it affected US-UK relations. So why did Britain vote against the use of military force? First, the ghosts of Iraq were all scarred by Iraq. The vote in Parliament wasn't a vote about Syria, it was a vote about Iraq. And Syria is not Iraq. The legacy of the Iraq War has been a loss of confidence in politicians and their ability to make the right decisions. It's been a distrust of intelligence, the dodgy dossier that got us into the Iraq War, and also general pessimism about intervention, that no matter how hard we try, no matter good intent, things don't go the way that we hope. In Iraq, we contributed to bringing about a civil war. We upset the balance of power in the region and then disengaged in such a way that left the perception that Iraq has become a client state of Iran. The second factor was that the public is much more influential now than it was before. The public has much more access to information. Party politics in Britain is in decline. And the public keep demanding evidence-based decision-making. They're no longer satisfied with gut reactions. So the British Prime Minister failed to build a convincing case for intervention. The public asked hard questions. We did nothing in the face of 100,000 Syrians killed. Why should we do something about 1,000 more killed? How will these proposed military strikes stop the killing? Yes, there's evidence it was a chemical weapons attack, but what evidence is there that Assad himself ordered the attack? And if we did attack, what would be the unintended consequences? It would kill innocent people, create more anti-Western sentiment. People argued that Syria is not our war. It's a civil war, it's a proxy war, we don't want to get involved. And some said, it's illegal to strike. We don't have the agreements of the UN Security Council. So the public were debating these questions, raising these questions, and the British Prime Minister wasn't able to build a convincing argument. So where has the UK vote left Britain? The UK has always prided itself in its internationalism. Since the end of World War II, the UK has stood with the US, shoulder to shoulder, to contribute to international security and to benefit from international order. So the vote has raised questions of Britain's role in the world. And the next day after the vote, there was a sense that what happens in Syria does affect us, whether we like it or not. We live in a connected world. Weak states can get hold of nasty weapons, and we've got transnational, international terrorism. What's happening in Syria is a massive humanitarian crisis. 120,000 people killed. A third of all Syrians are now displaced. And this summer I visited Syrian refugees in Jordan and Iraq, living in a state of limbo. The spillover is affecting the stability of our allies. And we've got young Brits leaving Britain and going off to Syria to fight. Many of them will come back, made more extreme by that experience. So what are the consequences if we do nothing about the situation in Syria? Syria is not going to go away. If we don't punish those responsible for the use of chemical weapons, how will we deter them or others from using them in the future? The conflict in Syria is perceived in the region to be empowering Iran. And there's concern that Iran might fear that there'll be no consequences for pursuing a nuclear weaponization program. Israel may feel that it can't rely on the West. Gulf allies may look to others for security guarantees, which might involve them giving more support to extreme jihadi groups. Russia and China filling the vacuum, influencing the New World Order. Non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah are becoming more powerful. And it's not an exaggeration to look at these things and say the Middle East may be heading towards a regional war. So that raises the question of how should the US respond? Intervention should be aimed at ending the killing, brokering a peace agreement, and stopping the spillover into neighboring countries. Threat of force by the US and use of it should contribute to that overall strategy, stopping the killing, brokering a peace agreement, stopping the spillover. It should not just be a compromise between those who want to stay out of Syria and those who want to bring about regime change. So the US needs to strengthen its diplomacy on 3 tracks. One level, US and Russia, to try and reach consensus on an acceptable outcome to the conflict in Syria. There's common ground. There's areas where Russia and the US can seek consensus, particularly on not wanting to see the growth and spread of jihadi groups. Second track is with regional powers to try and stop the arming of different sides in a proxy war. With the election of President Rouhani in Iran, it's a new opening, it's a new opportunity, and Iran should be given a seat at the table. And at the third track, between elements of the regime and elements of the opposition, there are moderate elements, semi-moderate elements on both sides who can be brought in to a political settlement. Regarding chemical weapons, there's an opportunity for a diplomatic response. The UN Security Council resolution condemning the use of chemical weapons. That looks a possibility now. The International Criminal Court could be used to investigate those responsible for the attack. If Assad commits to disposing of stockpiles and to allow in the inspectors, it's also stopping the escalation of the fighting. It will be difficult to get a UN resolution which then authorizes the use of force for international military action if the chemical weapons are not dealt with in that way, but it's something that we should continue to press with. Now, the world's not going to stop presenting us with these ethical problems and moral conundrums just because we're tired of war. The legacy of the Iraq War shouldn't be isolationism, but it should be searching for sensible strategies for confronting the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot, Frank, for inviting me here to this prestigious panel and to speak in front of this esteemed audience. I'll try to speak from here because I want to keep it as informal as I can. And actually, I do not have much to say after all what has been said, and especially after the lengthy debate that has been going on here in the States and elsewhere, where a fair amount of information and a fair amount of opinions have been circulated to the American public and to the international community. But I will try to be brief, and I'll try to raise a few points. My first point will be, as an Egyptian, an Arab, and a Muslim, will be to kind of try to convey to you how we feel about the possibility of military intervention in Syria. I have to tell you that we in the region, we have developed a kind of intrinsic skepticism towards any U.S. Attempt to military intervene in our region. Our experiences with the military of the U.S. has not been pleasant, whether in the near past or before this with the whole Western military. So even the most staunch supporters in Syria for U.S. military interventions are not doing this because they actually trust that the U.S. has a plan, or actually trust the U.S. good intentions. They're just doing it out of despair. It's like, okay, so we hit the bottom. What is gonna be worse than this? So let the U.S., maybe this will create different dynamics. But none of them, not a single person, if you ask him personally, will tell you, yes, I believe the U.S. has good intentions in Syria. This might be shocking, but this is the truth. History in our region is not favorable of any of this kind of U.S. actions. Second point is about the strike itself. For me and for many people I know, and actually I think it's pretty logic, that it is not morally unjustifiable. This strike, which is limited, surgical, which is only targeting chemical weapons. We believe, and everybody should believe, that chemical weapons are evil because they kill. So if you just remove chemical weapons out of the table and leave killing, then you are not doing good. There is no moral justification for intervention based on getting rid of chemical weapons alone. There has to be an end to this suffering. Well, my third point is about, okay, what if the President Obama goes tonight and declares that he's going to strike Syria anyway, whether with congressional approval or not? Then there are a number of points that we have to think about. The first one will be, what is the operational objective of such a strike? How can you declare a winner? When and how will President Obama or Assad come and say, I am victorious, mission accomplished? For Assad, he made this equation pretty clear. His media machine has already done the job, and they are portraying this as part of the overall international conspiracy led by the US against the anti-imperialism represented in himself. So this means whatever the US strikes, however long it might be, however damage it can happen to him, As long as he stays, then he can declare himself winner. And this is very much, it's not very strange in our region. Just, okay, so maybe your troops are heavily damaged, but you stay, then you are a winner. And actually, his troops believe in this, and his followers and supporters believe in this. So if he stays, if the military strike happens and he stays, which is basically the case because President Obama is promising a strike that is limited and is only targeting chemical weapons, then he is a winner. And for the chemical weapons, he actually made a very smart move with the Russians. So it's totally out of the table now. So what is the operational objective? What is the US actually seeking? Second thing related to the strike, what is the impact of such a strike on the war itself, on the battles in the ground on Syria? I cannot see if by the description of President Obama and Secretary Kerry of such a strike, a possibility to change the current balance except by maybe, potentially by neutralizing the Syrian Air Force. This can happen because this is not very easy, but it's doable because the Syrian Air Force depend on like 20 military airports. Actually, the 7 of them are only active, so they can be targeted. And if the Air Force, Syrian regime Air Force, is neutralized, then this can affect and have positive impact over the rebel side, especially in the northern area and maybe in the cities, especially in the cities of Aleppo and Idlib. But is this the case? I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows because the President and Secretary Kerry are not telling us, and nobody is telling us what is actually the plan. The third point related to the strike is how does it affect and influence the course for Geneva II? We have had a joint statement by the US and 9 other countries on the margin of G20 saying that Geneva II is the actual, is the current solution, is the solution to be followed, political solution through Geneva Communique. So what impact does this strike will this strike have on Geneva II? If this, my answer to this, if it's only targeting chemical weapons, then it doesn't have anything to do with Geneva II. Nothing is going to change. Okay, so the regime will still have his powers, his troops. He will still have Iranian backing, Russian backing, and he still controls Damascus, he still controls Homs, he still controls whole of the Sahel, of the coast area. So, and the opposition remain fragmented, unorganized, lack of leadership, lack of armament, lack of regular backing from any single country. So the situation does not really change. So what if this strike is just singled out, as it is as declarations of the President and his Foreign Minister, Secretary of State, then it will not have any change on Geneva II. My final point here, which is about, does the US have options? Did the US have options? We have for 31 months actually, and 120,000 people killed. And the US is not actually moving in the right trajectory. Everybody who is following this file will know that the US diplomacy and US political tools have not been used to stop the killing. The objective here, at least from my point of view and from Syrian point of view and Egyptian and the Arab and Muslim point of view and humanitarian point of view, will be to stop the killing, not to restore American leadership, not to regain credibility. The objective must be stop the bloodshed, stop the killing, which is only achievable through a controlled transition. It's not achievable through just toppling military operation, toppling Assad. And it's not achievable through just leaving the war continue. No, there has to be a controlled transition. How the US can achieve this? Strategy. Strategy. It's a word that we all repeat and we all talk about, but I did not see it. Diplomacy. Diplomacy is something that, I mean, the US State Department is huge. They have a lot of resources and a lot of smart diplomats, very smart ones. But they are not really in action. They are not really in action. And what we see with Russia now is very evident that maybe there can be a political solution. The Russians just moved because there has been some kind of like a threat, a carrot, a stick, but they do not see the carrot to actually move further. There has to be, okay. Okay, so I'll conclude here. So the US can actually move, can actually talk to its adversaries and its friends. The US has kept silent when the Saudi Arabia and Qatar were actually competing over on the Syrian file, and their competition was doing a lot of harm to the Syrian opposition and to the Syrian population. The US is keeping silent when Turkey's borders are heavily infiltrated by Chechens and Afghans and Pakistanis who who come from everywhere, and the fighters who come from everywhere, even from the UK, as Emma just pointed out, and cross the borders and establish Daesh or Nusra or any other entity that is fighting inside Syria. And the US can talk to Russia, and they can talk to Russia. And Russia, okay, you can think of Putin as an evil leader, an evil dictator, somebody who was trying to restructure the world in his own terms. Okay, but this is not the case here. At the end of the day, Putin will have some rational calculations to make. And no, I didn't see over the past 2 years any attempt to have Putin change his mind. Thank you.
I must thank my colleagues that they have actually abided to the tight time frame that I gave them. And I must also mention that we, of course, knew that the International Security Studies program actually has the best connections here on campus. But Charlie, of course, you surprised us with how far they actually reached. We now open the panel for question and answers. And I must say also, as tough as I was on my colleagues with regard to the time that I gave them, I must also urge you in this case to keep your questions short. We would like to have as many questions as possible, to talk about as many aspects as possible in the next hour or so that we have left. So I would ask you to refrain from longer statements and really put your question to the point. I open the forum now. I see a question over there.
Of course, it's exaggerated for effect, but underlying it, I think, is some of the facts of big power rivalries and life in the international scene, and I think also in the Washington political situation. It is fundamentally that the country, the U.S., the American people are not prepared to get into this. The polls show that. The Congress reads the polls. The president has been taking the country in that direction. So that in any kind of ordinary calculation of the political factors involved, the Congress would not give the president the authorization he is asking for. At the same time, in the last couple of days, it's become clear that this is severely painful in the Congress, apart from those out on the fringe in both parties, painful. You don't want to, I think Emma has brought this up in terms of Parliament and the British vote. You don't want to so severely damage a presidency as a no vote would do. Turning away from the president and the Secretary of State's very, very powerful arguments for action. So the scramble is on for what can we do to get out of this? And the answer has come forward in the idea of an agreement, an understanding by which Syria would turn its chemical, biological, and other weapons over to an international control system. And that's what's, I think, almost certainly going to happen. So that the president will make a tough speech tonight. He will talk about the necessity of action. but he will grasp as to a life-saving ring that way out, and then that will delay the process. And we know, and this was, I think, truly stated in the cable, that the Iranians particularly, others in the region, and the Russians also, have made a brilliant diplomatic record in manipulating such initiatives in ways that buy more time for them. So that this, if I had to make a guess about this, it's going to fade away, and in 6 months we'll be back where we were maybe in May or April. And tonight will be the moment when there'll be a lot of heavy talk, but it will begin to be diffused.
There was a question over there.
I've had the pleasure of, or displeasure of serving in Vietnam as well as the first Iraqi war. And I'll tell you, we've got ourselves involved in civil wars where we shouldn't have gotten involved. We've lost troops, and no matter what they say, we're about, oh, the U.S. is great, we're coming in. We don't have any support from even any other countries in this. We don't have NATO support. We don't have the support of The Hague saying, yes, let's take this guy up on war crimes. It doesn't make sense. But correct me if I'm wrong. That's what the panel's for.
Somebody actually want to take that up?
I mean, I'll respond very briefly to that, because I don't disagree with you, so there's not much correction to be done. The one thing I would say is I think what we also have to remember is there's a spectrum here, right? So what's been interesting, and this came up in discussions, and I think Mohammed has also raised this nicely, this idea that because we don't want to get so embroiled in another war that we keep sort of this mantra of no American boots on the ground, right? And I realize the pain of having been an American boot on the ground, but that I actually think, frankly, if I'm Arab, is insulting, right? The idea that it's okay to come in and strike, and you can kill others, but it's not going to strike you, and the sort of the quote of the sort of idea of a quite so limited strike that it doesn't get the reverberations is also problematic. So I would agree with you. I mean, in my mind, it is either sort of the don't strike notion, right, and find other ways to try to pressure and come up with real sort of diplomatic solutions, which I think, and here I entirely agree with my colleagues, that ending the killing should be the top priority and not sort of this question about sort of restoring American leadership. I mean, and you can restore American leadership by ending the killing, right? That's the other part of it. But I would say that that's sort of the kind of the major goal. And this idea of something that's limited, that keeps American boots off the ground and therefore not your experience, is problematic, as is the sort of the more potentially kind of full-blown war. So.
Can I just add in this? Just, sure. One thing, a very quick thing is, just to avoid the kind of any unintended mispresentation on the Arab side. I don't think that the Arab side is united behind any position. We've seen the Americans moved in Libya, for instance, and they were held by a majority of the Arabs. That was the first time I noticed a kind of an Arab acceptance. And here I'm not talking about all Arabs, but like a considerable segment of Arab societies, in judging from the social media, the Facebooks, and also the articles written in different journals and newspapers. So that was the first time that we see Arabs who would say, well, maybe the American force can be used in an enlightened way, and here's quote unquote. And on the Syrian issue, I mean, I disagree with any notion that says that the Arabs are against or for. I think, it's not either or. I think even there are a lot of Arabs who would love to see and here I'm not talking about regimes, by the way, regimes that are pro-American regimes. I'm talking about really activists in the Arab Revolution, the Arab uprising, etc. They see that, for all those who make the case against American intervention, and they can't really put an end to the killing machines operated by not only Assad but also regional powers. Here I'm talking about Iran. So if the Americans can move and do something to neutralize this machine, I think there is many people who would say good job. And many people would say it's not a good job. It's a kind of, it would reinforce a kind of a conspiracy. You know, as Muhammad says, like correctly and accurately, that many people was, no matter what the Americans gonna do in the Middle East, it would be seen as bad things. And when I read some articles in the newspapers, one of the arguments that, you know, since the Americans say yes for a bomb against Syria, it means it's good for Israel. So this kind of logic, you know, condition, some people would say no to any American action in the Middle East. But here, one more, but just not to mispresent the Arab side. I think there are a lot of division among the Arabs as to what they expect from the Americans.
There was one question there in the middle.
I want to ask the panel if they thought that the absence of like serious sustained action in Syria might invite worse war for the United States by risking strategic miscalculation on the part of the U.S.'s adversary. So I mean, might China, seeing that the U.S. having stated the red line and not seriously enforced it, take aggressive action against real American interests in, say, Japan or Taiwan, and then invite greater U.S. war than what we're contemplating now? And is that damage already done when Secretary Kerry describes the contemplated action as, quote, unbelievably small? You know, even if we do take action under the proposed guidelines, is it already seen as, okay, the U.S. doesn't defend its red lines? Is that going to get us into a worse situation?
The answer to what I hear you say is yes. And I think in all of this, wherever you want to come out on it, the missing dimension of the debate is the larger global international system, international community, international order, big power relationship dimension to it. We are always trying to drill down into the fine points of any problem, and if you deal with that fine point, then you can move on to the next one. But there's a larger framework here that is immense, and it's one that you can call the international system. It's been going on for a long time. The United States and a few others have been the stewards of it. And when the U.S. began to pull away from its role, now a few years ago, you could see, if you were tuned to these things diplomatically and in public commentaries, you can see that in every part of the world, countries, governments begin to make their rearrangements because they begin to say, well, the Americans are not going to be around, the Americans are not going to be counted on, the Americans are not going to bother us, so we've got to make our accommodations with others. So there's been a lot of deal-making going on already, going back some years now. And that's beginning to reshape the entire profile of what the UN calls, the maintenance of international peace and security. And it also, in the telegram that I read from, is not crazy. And you can see this in some of the articles by really profound intellectuals in China and Russia, beginning to talk about this is the end of an order. This is the end of an order that really has been holding the world in some sense together for generations. And if it's ending, then what are we going to do about it? Where will we find our role? So these big issues, I think, have got to be in the back of our minds as we approach these choices.
Charles, if you just allow a follow-up on that in this case. So you say in this case that there is an international system that might suffer there. One of the questions that I might put towards the panel is, in this case, can we actually say that this international system, which, as you might say in this case, has broken down recently or is on the way of getting, has it actually worked in the Middle East? Has the current configuration of power in this case, which of course was supported for a long time by the US, actually, has it worked?
Can I respond to this? Because actually I wanted to in a sense, in response to both, I totally agree with you, Hassan, that there's a wide range of opinion and we shouldn't characterize the Arabs as one thing. On the other hand, it also strikes me that there are, that we have to remember that, first of all, generally, there's a widespread of, I think, sort of set of Arabs who would say that the international system had not actually worked very well for them in the past. And here, this is where it's sort of the basis of kind of the anti-American sentiment that we were talking about before. You can see it in polls and you can see it in a lot of places. And attitudes towards why is America sort of shoring up our dictators and saying it likes democracy and all sorts of things, I mean, have been, way preceded the Arab uprisings. Okay, so I think we can't forget that, and we also similarly can't forget that we live in a world where there's no longer private debates. We can't have a debate even at Yale and say, you know, we need to make sure America stays the leader of the world and we maintain our our place in order, and not think that it's going to be picked up and somebody in Egypt is going to hear it and Syria is going to say, see, we told you so, and that's why Bashar is our defense against those imperialists. And so we can't, it's an interesting issue, right, Charlie, because we may want to have on the table, and I mean, if it's in the back of our minds, I think it's, in a sense, it needs to stay there, because when we have these debates about what this does to American order, even if we think American order is great for the world, there's an audience out there that's hearing that doesn't necessarily think it's great for the world, and that doesn't necessarily sort of share those goals. So I think we have to remember we've got multiple audiences that hear all of these debates, and that while there's a variation in opinion about something like, you know, should the Americans sort of strike Syria, and what's the sort of impact of that, and even sort of what should be the sort of the regional order, that there are some things in which there's a lot of widespread agreement on. And the fact that the American order hasn't really helped Arabs generally is one of those things I would say it's a fairly sort of, you know, it's like Americans thinking democracy is better than communism. Maybe there's a few communists out there, but just generally we're pretty agreed on it.
This is of huge significance, and this is not an American order. The United States has been the most active leader of defending the order, but this order is a world order. It's agreed to, has been across 150 years at least. It is the international state system. This is an order of states. In the Middle East, it has not worked well, but every part of the Arab world is a state. The Arab League's name is the Arab League of States. The negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians is over a two-state solution. And if you take away this system, what system will replace it? That's where we're talking about something that's been going on for really 3 centuries. And if it goes, then what is going to come after is not going to be pretty.
There was Mohammed
Yeah,
first, and then I actually give back the question.
Yeah, just a very brief comment for what it means, what the American and what the international order means in the Arab world, and what the American order or the American leadership mean for the Arab world. Actually, most of the governments in the Arab world are friendly to the U.S. and actually they try to sustain the relationships with the U.S. as much as they can, with few exceptions. But this means but when we ask any U.S. president, American president, about what are the U.S. interests in the Arab world or in the Middle East, it will be first security of Israel, second will be secure oil resources. Which, if we think of it from the flip side, from the other side, it means okay, keep Palestine neglected and forget about the atrocities. And second thing, keep using and abusing our natural resources, because the Americans want to be rich and our countries have to remain poor. This is how it can be perceived. Maybe some people are more sophisticated, are more able to build a better understanding of the situation, are more able to partner with the US. But the message that the layperson, the average person in the streets in the Arab world, they get it like this: that the US government's leadership means security of Israel, which keep Palestine occupied and forget about it, and keep utilizing our resources. And for the international system, there is like, okay, we can actually speak about this and about how the US actually did not really respect the international regulations and international system regulations, especially the UN, many times, especially in our part of the world. And one of the most used example is the 242, the Security Council resolution of 242 for the occupied territories, Palestinian territories by Israel. This Security Council resolution has been there for more than 40 years, and the US has never actually tried to implement it. And it means a lot for the Arab world. Thank you.
More questions? Let me take this over there.
You mentioned several possible scenarios for the coming year or two. What are the possible implications of these scenarios for the territorial integrity of Syria and for the stability of Lebanon?
You want me to answer that? Okay. Others are also welcome to join in. In some ways, right? I mean, this gets back to this question about if there's sort of the continue the war. There's the sort of beef up the rebels and let them win, and then there's the try to get to the sort of the table as quickly as possible. And frankly, in terms of the regional stability, which actually is been undermined and will continue to be undermined as long as the conflict in Syria goes on, then getting some kind of an end as quickly as possible, I think, is the imperative. So it's not just about stopping the killing in Syria. It's actually in some ways about stopping the possibilities and the expansion of killing elsewhere. And so in my mind, the third scenario is sort of optimal in that sense. I mean, and the continuing the war, frankly, is the worst scenario in that sense, even though there's people who seem to think that you can't let them win and you can't let them lose. And then the question of, again, arming the rebels, I didn't explain it very well when I was talking, but, you know, the arming the rebels, if you got to the rebels winning, if you're willing to really arm them and really make, you know, really sort of change the balance, right? And that's huge, because that's not just about changing the balance between the regime and the rebels. It really is also recognizing that Iran will and Russia and others will play a role in this. You know, that requires, I think, frankly, a level of commitment we're probably not willing to make. If that was made, if there were that kind of outcome, I mean, that, and quickly, that could lead also, I think, to sort of helping to secure the regional balance and the regional power. But in my mind, the best scenario is trying to find, you know, the levers and sort of to really move the players to the table. I actually don't think that's easy. When I said I actually welcome my colleagues' sort of input on this, I really meant it. I mean, I think it's much easier to say, I'll get them to the table than it is actually to figure out how to do that.
There's really only one scenario, and it's an unfortunate one, but it's a fact of the region. And that is that we, the outside world, and those in the Arab world largely, telling themselves and telling us for decades and decades and decades that they were stable and unified, had only one policy, there was only one Arab nation, and the only problem was Israel. And then, a few years ago, Iraq was lifted. And the difference between what is happening there now and what was happening there 10 years ago is gigantic, because when the rock was lifted, it turned out to be a big lie. That underneath the rock were innumerable factions and forces that instantly were at each other's throats within the region, within the faith. And what you have now across the region, sometimes openly and sometimes below the surface, but about to burst through, are really three civil wars going on within the Arab Islamic world. And one is Sunni versus Shia. And the other, very consequential, is between those, however Muslim they may be, however they take their politics, who want to be states in the international state system, and those who want to destroy it and take it over and put another system in effect, such as Al-Qaeda. And the third civil war, which has been at least momentarily crushed, is the Arab Spring. And that is a young, youthful movement that is none of the old gang parties, neither the Muslim Brotherhood nor the old militaries, who have come out on the streets, hopeful, wanting an open society, wanting possibilities for a better life and a better economy. And they came out and we welcomed them around the world in January 2011. And very quickly, they were crushed. They're not gone, they're going to come back. But now it's back to the old guys again. The old dictators and the old militaries and the old Islamists. And when you have civil wars, they don't end in conferences in Geneva. They end by somebody winning the war. And nobody can stop that. We can, around the edges, do humanitarian operations, maybe something about the chemical weapons, but we can't stop these civil wars. Somebody's going to win it. It's going to be like the North and the South in the American Civil War. Somebody's going to win it, and it's going to take a long time for it to happen.
Although maybe this is an occasion to spell this out to our audience clearly. what would be in this case a positive, or in this case the least the least negative outcome that we could expect in this case out of the civil war? Charlie, of course, you just said there must always be a winner, but I remember, for instance, when we take a look at the civil war that was raging in the former Yugoslavia, there was a process that ended in the Dayton Peace Agreement. That was a conference that in effect ended the civil war, and that ended the civil war with the establishment eventually, in this case, of by now 4 new countries. Is that something that we might also see in Syria?
I think the best outcome is for the war to be fought to a point where neither of these various sides can conclude that it can win.
But that's already the case almost.
That's not impossible. I think that's what happened in Bosnia.
Right.
The point was, the Croats said, I can't live under the Serbs. The Serbs said, I can't live under the Bosniaks. The Bosniaks says, I can't live under any of these people, and I'm willing to die before I will be ruled by them. And there's something of that going on in the Middle East now. So at a certain point, exhaustion, murderous exhaustion, can bring about a conclusion, but we're not there yet.
Hassan?
Thank you. All I want to add to this is that the conflict is not only within Syria, it's over Syria. And this brings the regional actors, and this is very important, and that's why I think it is, I cannot see any part of the civil war right now in Syria can win in the foreseeable future. Because it doesn't matter how much the Iranians, how the Saudis will step in and give money and arms. So it's going to continue. It's like, keeping the ball in the air, like without going down. It's going to continue for a while unless there's an agreement among the actors that underpin the civil war. And here I'm not talking about the Syrians, because we've seen, like when the Russians said that the Syrian regime can hand over the chemical weapon, Assad said yes. So he, who called the shots in Syria? Assad? I really doubt that. I think that the Iranians are more important, and the Russians are more important, because once Putin said, okay, let's just do something about the chemical weapon, the first one to come in public and say yes, this is a good deal is Assad himself. So that's why maybe I have like a little disagreement over whether we can do it in Geneva or not. I think a framework that is an agreed upon framework among the regional actors and among the international actors that have stake in the Syrian is a preconditions for stability, and at least it can ameliorate the civil war, even if it cannot end that.
Emma, and then I open the floor again for questions.
Yes, I also have slight disagreements with Charlie on this. I don't think when you look at the civil war that is taking place inside Syria, it is not simple by any stretch of the imagination. It is not Sunni, Shia. It doesn't break down that easily. The reasons why people support the regime, for some it's existential fear of the alternative. So the regime does have supporters who are Sunnis, it has supporters who are Christians, obviously has strong Alawite support. But the opposition also has supporters who are Sunni, supporters who are Christian, supporters who are Alawite. So it's really, really not clear-cut. Yes, most civil wars do end when one side defeats another, but not all civil wars end that way. And with Syria, yes, parties are getting exhausted, not totally exhausted, but exhaustion can come. Well, there's things that we can do to help bring on that exhaustion. So as I was mentioning before, at one level, it needs to be an agreement between Russia and the US, and it can't just be Assad must go, Assad must stay. It cannot just be this agreement, or this argument over Assad. No dialogue is going to start if that is the starting point. So it has to be, how do we stop the killing? So then with the regional parties who are fueling this conflict, it's a proxy war that's going on. How do we get them to stop arming, paying, equipping the different sides, the different fighters? A lot of it goes back to Iran, it goes back to the Islamic Revolution, fear of Iran's expanse and influence in the region. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but that's the perception of it. Some of these countries feel they lost Iraq to Iran. So it's a power struggle that's playing out over Iran. People can break it down and say it's Sunni Shia. It's more to do with Iran versus Saudi versus Turkey. So if we can try and stop that proxy war that's going on, how do we try and stop that? Because we produce a vision of an outcome that is not one side wins, one side loses. That's the existential fear. It's a vision of an inclusive settlement inside Syria, a settlement that's acceptable, Russia, US, acceptable to the regional powers, acceptable to the people who live in Syria. So this cannot be one side winning and the other side losing. It has to move away from the zero sum if there's any hope of stopping this just contagion spreading through the region.
Over there in the back at the, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if the panel could outline what specific national interests, American national interests, are at stake in Syria, and what possible methods do we have available to us in order to pursue those interests. So for instance, if we were to attack Syria, in pursuit of what interest would we do that, and what would a good outcome be? At the same time, if we were to do nothing, that's also a strategy, and what would and how would that help us secure our national interests?
The national interest is pretty much as I have said before, and that is that what happens in Syria could tip the balance so that the entire region would come under one hegemon, probably Iran, and or, because Iran is an adversary of the international system, the entire region would drop out of world order. And if that's the case, that would be, I think, almost a fatal blow to world order as we have known it for a long time. And the US has been the policeman of this. So when we see the politicians saying, we can't be the policeman, there's no other policeman. It's like saying, we're not going to have any policemen in New Haven. And then you can say, well, as long as the gunfire is not on my block, I don't care. But there's a bad part of town. If there are no policemen, the bad part of town is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the fundamental American interest.
Can I add on something to that, which is it cannot be forgotten that this is, Charlie's right. I mean, the fear is that the region goes under a hegemon that is not our friend, and that's, you know, Iran/Russia, et cetera. It matters to us, and Mohammed mentioned this earlier, because Israel's there and because oil's there. I mean, we shouldn't shy away from recognizing that we particularly care in this part of the region. In fact, we particularly care in there more than we do about North Africa, for example, also part of the Arab Muslim world, but not necessarily so important for us strategically as we do in what's happening with essentially borderline states to Israel, you know, pipeline states to and states that are very close and bigger actually at the end of the day than the Gulf states that are nearby. So that's something to recognize, that that's part of what drives the grand concern. One could argue much to the detriment of the region for decades, but that's part of what drives that.
At the very back there.
Putting aside diplomatic opinions for a second, is there a solution for people within Syria that they would be okay with us not staying in? Is Assad a end-all be-all? And so if that's the case, then how can we even talk about ending the bloodshed without the agreement of people living there?
Okay. Well, for me, I mean, apart from any diplomatic talk, Assad cannot stay. This is one thing that has to be said, and very clearly, Assad cannot stay. But the point is that negotiations and the ways that lead to an outcome cannot start by saying this. This is the point. Assad cannot stay. This is a done deal. I would say like more than 40-50% of the population cannot actually stay in a country in which Assad is the ruler. Maybe he still has the support of like 30% of the population, but this 30% of the population actually do not look at him personally. They just seek security. Most of them, at least. Most of them seek security. There are parts of them who have like personal interests and personal leverages and even regional. They are the guardians of regional interests that have to be negotiated upon. So having said that, there is a solution. There is a political solution. What is the solution? In diplomacy and in any kind of politics, international relations is based on, like, you have to have options. You have to tell any country that you are dealing with, okay, I'm negotiating. This means that you take something and you give something. It's very easy. So, okay, what did the U.S. offer Russia? What did the U.S. offer for the regime in Syria, the parts of the regime who can actually be part of the new transition? What did the U.S. offer even Iran? I know that this is like a very hot topic and very controversial, but what did the U.S. do to do this? And on the other hand, what did the U.S. Do to affect their leverage? So, for example, Iraq. This is a country that has been invaded by the U.S. This is a country that their military and their government and everything there was almost established by the U.S. And the U.S. does not have leverage on Iraq. The U.S. cannot actually tell Iraq, you are the main supply route for Assad. If Iraq closes its airfield for like the planes that come from Iran to Syria, then Assad will have very limited supply. But the U.S. is not doing this. So the U.S., there is, and here I agree with Professor Charles Hill, that the U.S. has a severe problem in leadership. The U.S. does not exercise its leadership with any kind of a vision in the region. This has to be tackled. There is a solution, a possible solution. It's very difficult, very complicated, needs a lot of work, but this is a world, and nothing is easy.
Sorry, over here.
With respect to the very narrow issue of chemical weapons, and regardless of whether that issue is even worth solving, is it plausible that a negotiated settlement of that issue, as has surfaced in the last day or two, could be effective in resolving that little issue?
It can be, but it will take a very, very, very long time. It's a very complicated logistics and political issue. And the people who are offering to do it are not the people that you would buy a used car from. So,
But what would you do? Take up that option or not?
well, I think politically, practically speaking, it will be taken up. Yes, you can't not take it up. But as we do, and this is true of many diplomatic initiatives and negotiations in and around and of and for the Middle East, you find very shortly that the other side is playing games with you. They are wanting to postpone a meeting. They want to move it from Geneva to Istanbul. They will be giving different stories to the press one day and another day. And pretty soon you're tangled up in knots. So it can happen if the side that is representing the international community will hold the other side to serious negotiations. But we have not done that.
But if you start on that little issue, would that process help everybody work on other issues?
What's going to happen is that if we will accept this proposal to turn the weapons over to the international community, there will be a meeting set for 2 weeks from now. That'll not get anywhere, but it was important to meet. Then there'll be another one set, and that will be postponed. And pretty soon we're going to be down by the end of November to it's not going anywhere. So then somebody's going to say in the Congress, it's not going anywhere, so now you have to strike and go to the UN, and Russia will veto it.
Well, that speaks to our limitations.
Right.
But if we start an international group of Russians, Syrians, Egyptians, Iranians, Americans, whoever the hell they all are, to try to start to talk about the chemical issue, is that, as a practical matter, because we're all human beings, is that going to lead to broader discussions that might be helpful?
No, that's Model UN.
Hassan briefly and Mohammed briefly.
Well,
Thanks for the
all I want to say about this is that the failure to acknowledge the interest of different players have only complicated the issue. So it's not about even the civil war in Syria. It's the symptoms of of the root cause of the problem here, the clash of strategies in the Middle East. The Iranians have been using what is happening in Syria in the context of a war of attrition with the American strategy. And America has a problem here. It's kind of, on the one hand, I think America can live with a nuclear Iran based on deterrence. But the Israelis think that a nuclearized Iran would be an existential threat to them. And here, like, given the relationship between America and Israel, it is really difficult to see any way of America not committing itself to the strategy of prevention. And this complicates the matter more with the Iranians, that they can actually make hay of what is happening in Syria and actually fueling that. So what I want to say is that among these actors, like the Iranian, the Israelis, the American, the Russian, there should be like a kind of talk and agree on how to respect and acknowledge their mutual interests or their separate interests in the region. I think then a political solution would be possible.
Mohammed, briefly.
Yeah. Well, the point is, I do agree that there is a possibility if the dynamics started to roll on. I mean, if we have a move on the chemical weapons, a diplomatic one, maybe as Professor Charles says, the model United Nations, when the bazaar mentality will like control and like negotiating and bargaining before even you start the actual negotiations. So this is our part of the world, and this is what we do all the time. But but on the other hand, if the U.S., as I said, exercise leadership and put an objective, and it says very clearly that it will put the enough resources in order to reach this objective, then dynamics might be created in order to reach this objective. One thing is that you have to identify and make the Russians identify what they need actually in Syria. What is their interest? Maybe is it Tartus naval facility? I think it's one of their interests, but it's not a very big one. There is like another. Is it like they need men in this regime and the establishment of the coming regime? So they need part of the military and part of the security agencies to be part of the new regime. Maybe the U.S. and the world, anybody who wants to solve the Syrian crisis needs to identify, to help the Russians and possibly the Iranians identify their real interests in Syria, and maybe then we can reach a compromise, because otherwise it's like Russia speaking about the different world order and the US speaking about the rise of the rest. So it will not go anywhere this way.
And very briefly.
Very, very briefly, because I slightly disagree with you actually on whether or not Assad can stay. And that's I recognize this is a fairly radical statement, but this is getting to your point of thinking about what different groups need and what different actors need. I mean, there is also, we are tending to think within sort of the unified Syria notion. And I'm not advocating this. I'm simply saying that there are many ways in which these negotiations can actually take place, and there's many different sort of potential solutions out there. So part of it is, what do you need? Do you need the naval base? Do you need et cetera? Part of it is, that the extent to which the 30% of the population that actually supports Assad is actually not necessarily sprinkled across the state. I mean, it's clear that there are pockets where, you can imagine the north actually sort of breaking away. You can imagine actually for the whole region, and again, this is not an advocation, I want to make that very clear, but the realm of possibilities goes beyond simply what's the chips that we can trade over the state as it looks like today, and given the sort of the players who are there. And I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Right. I will take two more questions in this case, and one is in the front here.
How realistic is the assumption that Iran is a key player in the area, will be able to control the region in the future? And because, it's Shia and it supports Shia Arabs, when at the end of the day, Iran is not an Arab state. And to what extent will Arabs, even Shia Arabs, accept Iran as a regional power?
So you mean in this case that there is the fact that they speak a different language in this case makes a significant difference in terms of strategy?
The fact that they're not an Arab state.
Leading the pan-Arab sort of, yeah.
I think it's a very important point, very important. And maybe fundamentally over the long run, that will be the deciding factor. But the Iranian regime going back to the Ayatollah Khomeini, has thought about that and addressed it. And in its ideology, which is a very much revision structured ideology, revisionist in the sense of changing the Shia faith itself in the way it's managed, thought of itself as being able to bridge that gap. And they've got Arabic speakers, and they've got their supporters inside Iraq in an Arab Shia-led country. They've got Hezbollah, they've got Shia populations that are in the west of the region, Hezbollah particularly on the Mediterranean. So there's a kind of an archipelago of Iranian-backed Shia and some others who are Sunni as well that the Iranians have done a lot to cultivate, as in the case of Hamas in Gaza. So it's a strategy. It's a strategy that's backed by, and I think this is a big factor in the drive for nuclear weapons. When you get nuclear weapons, the most important thing is you don't have to use them. People are just scared of you. And pretty soon they will begin to gravitate in your direction, particularly in the Middle East, where the primary motivation is fear. That is, who's going to be in charge of me next month? And if the Iranians can back that up with their ideology and their strategy, they've been trying that pretty well. But your question may ultimately be the correct one. They may not be able to do it because they're not Arab.
Yeah. Mohammed briefly and Hassan briefly.
Okay, very, very briefly, well, I tend to agree and disagree with Professor Charles Hill here. Iran is a strong player, a very strong player in the region, but it can never actually, to put it more precisely, it's very overestimated to think that it's going to be the hegemon over the region. It's not Arab, it's not Sunni, and Shia Arabs are Shiites in general are only 10% of the whole Muslim community in the world. And on the other hand, the experience of Hamas, Iran has helped and supported Hamas for years, and whether by money or by training or even armament. But then, when it came a moment when the Sunni Shiite factor emerged, Hamas actually sided with the Sunnis, did not side with Iran, and Hamas left Syria. Hamas is not in Syria any longer. Hamas does not support Bashar al-Assad. Actually, they stand very openly against him and against the Iranian interests. So, Iran a big country, big history. I don't see it as a power of good in the region. Iran is doing a lot of bad things into many countries in the region, but it's very much overestimated to say that they are going to hegemonize over most of the country.
Hassan briefly.
I just want to add that I think Iran has proxy assets and capabilities in the Mashriq and the Levant and the Gulf, of course, like Al-Houthi in Yemen and also in Bahrain. We cannot underestimate Iran. Up until 2006, the Iranian Ahmadinejad was among the most popular in the Middle East, among the Arabs. Ibn Khaldun Research Center, headed by Sa'ad-Din Ibrahim, put Ahmadinejad only after Hassan Nasrallah, so all Shia. I'm talking about the sample was Sunni, completely Sunni. But again here, that's the importance of what is happening in Syria. It really polarized the region. Now Iran is seen differently. Hassan Nasrallah is no longer popular in Jordan, for instance, or in the West Bank, or in Gaza, or in Egypt even worse. So I think the Shia-Sunni factor will be detrimental to the Iranian outreach in the region and the Iranian influence in the region.
There's one word, which is the interesting thing about the support for Iran, which was also with Nasrallah, was that it was actually because they stood up to the U.S.
Israel in 2006.
Well, to Israeli, but also the Iran vis-a-vis the West as seen as sort of the bulwark against it. So the interesting thing is, if it did become a hegemon, it would lose actually that status, which is kind of a twist.
And we should say that Hassan Nasrallah in this case is the leader of Hezbollah, of course. Now, the last question, please. Yeah? In the middle there. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
No, the woman in the black hair, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. Yes. Yes, yes.
So I have a quick follow-up question to that point. So top down, but let's think about the bottom up. The other question is also an empirical question, which is about you know, the threat of U.S. strikes. From what I understand, I've been seeing reports that there have been mass defections from the Syrian army. Can anyone from the panel confirm that this is true? Because that in and of itself is a very interesting point. It says something about what the potential of a U.S. strike could mean. And then if I could just make one very, very short comment, which is that I think if we've learned one thing from the Arab Spring, as far as this idea that the region is going to lose the nation state, and what will the political formation look like? One thing we've learned from the Arab Spring, I don't like that term, I like the dignity revolutions, but one thing we've learned is that they were both national and transnational movements, right?
Maybe the empirical question first. Do we know anything about defections in this case?
Yeah, okay. I can answer to this. I mean, there has been defections, but they are not massive defections. Actually, because now there is we have to know that there are many factors now unifying the forces of Assad. One of them is interest, one of them is sectarian, and one of them is ideological. And we cannot, and more importantly is that the absence of alternative. So okay, so where are they going after defection? So there has been defections, but not massive, and that cannot actually change the balance on the ground. I need to respond to the question of the nation states. Well, this is not part of any official or institutional beliefs, but I do not really see a nation state in the Arab world. We do not have nation states. Especially in the Mashriq, most of the states have been actually created by colonial powers in this way. There is no nation state. The nation is, whether it's Arab or the Muslim, or maybe we can trace some Syrian traces, but the borders and the way the states have been created are not actually nation states, and they have not been created in a healthy, and were not given healthy time and healthy environment to produce a sense of nationhood. And this is something I have witnessed in Syria. There is a very high sense of region locality in Syria. So a person from Homs and a person from Damascus, a person from Aleppo, they in a way feel different. They do not really feel that they belong to a certain thing, certain state. So this is something that maybe needs to evolve in order to have maybe Nasser was right about pan-Arabism, maybe, or maybe we, maybe there are tons of and huge possibilities out there, as Professor Lust spoke.
Does the panel want to add anything? Well, so I thank very much our panel for a very fruitful discussion that we had, and I also thank you for attending. Thanks very much.